Good morning. I'm Harold Meyerson from the American Prospect. And this is a coterie of my mother's friends who are applauding there. So on behalf of the Prospect, which worked with the Albert Shanker Institute and Hillman putting this event together, thank you very much. Particular thanks to Leo Casey for all the good work he and his folks did putting all of this together. I will add that, as was not the case until about 3 minutes ago, there are now copies of the American Prospect back on the table there. We are this year celebrating our 25th anniversary, which is not as much as the New Republic, which just celebrated its 100th, but then you know what happened to the New Republic. And I also want to introduce my leader, perhaps America's most distinguished social democrat and editor of the Prospect, Robert Kuttner, who is here today. And the Prospect has a proud heritage of taking young college graduates, actually paying them to be our writing fellows, and later today, one of those folks, Rachel Cohen, will moderate a panel and be the youngest person up here today. So the Prospect last summer sent me to Seattle to write about the minimum wage victory there. And after knocking around Seattle for a couple of days, I realized that really was not the story. The story was, as we all know, how difficult it is to organize workers and get a collective bargaining contract in this day and age, and what that spilled over to, which was quite remarkable in Seattle. What I found out was that in the town of SeaTac, which is where the airport is, the Fight for 15, a brilliant campaign, had been trying to organize workers at the airport, service workers. There weren't that many of them, a few thousand. And the airport authority and the ghostly presence, really, that controls the airport, Alaska Airlines, said no. And so you'll hear today from two folks, one on this panel, David Rolfe, one on a later panel, Sejal Parikh, who heads Working Washington, the Fight for 15 in Washington. Decided sort of to call the airport's bluff, and they put a ballot measure on the SeaTac ballot in November 2013 that really said immediately wages in SeaTac are going to go up to $15 an hour. And, you know, really this was just a way to try to get Alaska Airlines and the airport to the table. I mean, confronted with this, why wouldn't you negotiate for a few thousand workers? But in the time-honored tradition of American employers in this day and age, they didn't. Lo and behold, the measure passed, and it helped inspire the very good fast food campaign in the much larger neighboring city of Seattle, and 100,000 workers became subject to a process by which their minimum wage will be raised to $15 an hour. So it was easier, yeah. This was hard as hell and required all kinds of the kind of four-cushion shots that are required these days to win victories for workers. But it was still easier than organizing a few thousand workers at the airport. Get a raise for 100,000 workers, a significant raise, or organize a few thousand workers at the airport. And this said to me that we really need to look at all the panoply, all the range of campaigns that are going on now, assess them, look at strategies, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and that's what Leo and I were hoping for when we discussed initially this conference. Today, there are victories for workers going on in campaigns initiated by unions and proto-unions. There are minimum wage hikes in a whole range of cities and states. There are paid sick days in an increasing number of jurisdictions, and of course the President is going to argue for this in his forthcoming State of the Union address. There is an organization of domestic workers that has now won Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights in 4 states. In San Francisco, they have just enacted the Retail Workers' Bill of Rights, which requires employers to give their workers 2 weeks' notice, to 2 weeks advance notice on what their schedule will be so that their workers can actually plan their lives. What a radical concept that is, and I don't see why there aren't a hell of a lot of other cities that shouldn't be adopting this in the forthcoming months. Taxi workers in New York are getting favorable rulings from the taxi commissions, but, none of the things I have just alluded to have resulted in collective bargaining agreements. You know, you could say, okay, yeah, but the legislation is great. Well, the legislation is great, but in every case, the campaign for it has been waged by organizations backed up by actual existing unions. So this is the catch-22. Unless we can increase the number and power of worker organizations that have the clout and the ability to sustain themselves, we will ultimately not even be able to win that which we've been able to win in the legislative arena. Nonetheless, as we look at where the workforce is headed, and particularly at the rise of contingent work, you do have to question what is the best model for a workforce in which more and more workers are not actually officially listed as employees. A cautionary note, there was just a piece in the Financial Times earlier this week about Japan, noting that Japan actually has a very low unemployment rate, but that wages in Japan, as in most of Europe and in the United States, have been absolutely flat despite a condition of high employment. Now, I mean, this gets to the conundrum of, well, if unemployment falls, if employment rises, wages will eventually rise. Well, I mean, the short answer to that is no, they won't. We're seeing this in Japan, we are seeing this here. Wages do not rise as the tide comes in. They will not rise ultimately unless workers have a seat at the table and a demonstration outside the door. So what we are seeing in the current period of American labor is kind of a not conscious drift, I think, towards something a little more like the Knights of Labor than the AFL in the late 19th century. The Knights of Labor were a mid-late 19th century collective organization that welcomed members and played no special emphasis on getting them contracts in their workplace. And they were the organization at that time that was demonstrating for the 8-hour day. And they rose in a sort of parallel historic continuum along with the AFL, which did focus on workplace organizing and got contracts. Now, the problem for the Knights, although they were in many ways far more progressive than the early AFL in the 19th century, the problem with the Knights was that when they hit a political rough stretch, as they did after Haymarket in Chicago, and when they hit the Depression of the 1890s, they couldn't sustain themselves. They vanished. They're gone. Which gets us, I think, to focus on the fact that we are currently winning in certain cities, in blue cities. Most cities are blue. In certain states, most cities are red, but even red states, as you know, this November voted to raise the minimum wage. South Dakota, Nebraska, Alaska, Arkansas, that you can't sustain these victories and you can't do more unless you have a workers' organization behind it. And so the purpose of today is to hear from a range of folks, such as Karen Nussbaum and David Rolfe, who are actively engaged in figuring out what kind of workers' organizations we can build today, what kind of new strategies, what kind of new organizational forms are relevant. There is still, as Tafari absolutely accurately noted, there is still some good, what we might call conventional organizing going on, but really today no organizing is conventional in the sense in which Randy was alluding to in the organizing campaigns of the 30s and 40s. We're seeing HERE, Unite Here, continues to grow, although this is partly related to the power Unite Here has in particular cities, with city governments helping them out, and the power they have in some hotels that are already unionized, that are owned by the same folks who have hotels that are not unionized. We are seeing things like the campaign spearheaded by the IBEW and the LA Alliance for a New Economy, Lane, which just got a union neutrality agreement at a new factory that will be built to build rail cars for the LA metro system, hopefully better than the ones in the DC metro system. And the key component here was the purchasing power of the LA Transit District, which wanted a local facility that had union representation, the presence of the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, in working this deal out. So organizing can require political pressure, and it can require all kinds of new strategies. And you'll hear some of them today. You'll hear from Rich Kallenberg about should labor organizing become a protected right under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, for which violating that has much more serious consequences than violating the National Labor Relations Act. You'll hear about the kind of union arrangement that the UAW is working out with Volkswagen in Chattanooga, and about the possibility of members-only unionism, something that Tom Gagan has written about in his new book, and that Catherine Fisk, law professor at UC Irvine, has written about and we'll talk about today. And the whole conundrum, which none of us have figured out very well, of a workforce which has a huge number of independent contractors, of contingent workers, of workers who work full-time and are mysteriously labeled temporary workers. I've seen this in the warehouses outside Los Angeles, where they ship the goods that come in at the ports of LA and Long Beach, where 40% of the imports come in, and this is there are 270 temporary employment agencies in this area. You can work there forever. You can have a different employer every week. The state of California is beginning to push back on this. You're going to hear a lot of this stuff. It is not hard to poke holes in many of these new strategies. If one of them clearly worked, we wouldn't need to have this discussion. Sejal Parikh from Working Washington has a piece on the Prospect website. We have already put up 4 articles from people participating in this panel on the American Prospect website, www.prospect.org. We will put up more, and along with the Shanker Institute, we will also put up a video of the day's proceedings. And Sejal Parikh, discussing one campaign, wrote, "We haven't yet found the right model for workers' organizations." That's true. That's why we need to have this discussion today. We hope today's conference advances that discussion and accelerates the process by which we find the model or those models that will help us build a just and better America. Thank you.